The IRS began targeting conservative groups as far back as 2010, and senior IRS officials have known about it for almost 2 years.
The challenge for the IRS here was how to process, how to prioritize this mass of applications for 501c4. And so they went through this filter.
Targeting groups with Tea Party or Patriot in their names, the IRS was also tracking groups whose goals included, quote, limiting government and educating on the Constitution and Bill of Rights.
We don't know why they did it, if it was a matter of conscious decision by someone who didn't like conservative groups, or just sheer incompetence, but it doesn't really matter. The problem is the IRS decided to target a particular political philosophy. It happened to be conservative, but it could just as easily been libertarian or liberal or something else, and look at these groups for a special examination.
The impact is that it has a chilling effect on the speech of those who are targeted for abuse.
The IRS regulations provided that only a certain part of a C4's activities could be directly political.
Somebody at IRS wrote the regulation that says you're exclusively engaged in social welfare purposes as long as you are not primarily engaged in partisan political activities. In order for IRS to make a decision, it has to decide whether an activity is partisan political activity in nature. And so you just open up the agency for the potential for abuse by having bureaucrats having to make that kind of decision.
This is inherent in the problem we have with a heavy regulatory state, particularly in the political area.
That opportunity shouldn't exist, either for a bureaucrat to make a boneheaded decision or for a political appointee or even a career bureaucrat to make a decision for his or her own political ends.
The IRS, as an independent agency, requires absolute integrity, and people have to have confidence that they're applying it in a nonpartisan way.
Now, in this case, it was deciding whether to grant tax-exempt status, but it just as easily could have been an audit program.
As bad as this incident was, these kinds of incidents have happened before.
The IRS has a history, a pretty sorry history, of being used by presidents from Roosevelt through Nixon to go after enemies of the administration.
I keep thinking of this phrase from White House counsel John Dean in a 1971 memo where he talks about using the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies. Well, it turns out this wasn't just a Nixon thing. FDR used to regularly order up audits of political opponents. JFK started a task force within the IRS devoted to targeting right-wing groups. LBJ turned the IRS against organizations opposing the Vietnam War. So it turns out that presidents of both parties, we found out after Watergate, really enjoyed using the IRS to screw their political enemies.
Some people are responding to this by saying, you know, what this really means is we need more disclosure and we need the rules about disclosure to be clarified.
The efforts that are being made in Congress and by others outside the Congress to put the IRS in a more active role in monitoring nonprofit groups on campaigns would be a serious mistake.
It's a strange argument, isn't it? I mean, that you're going to give more information, more power, really, to an agency, perhaps the IRS, probably the IRS, in light of what's already happened.
So all of this adds, I think, an extra layer of irony to the president's recent commencement address at Ohio State University.
Unfortunately, you've grown up hearing voices that incessantly warn of government as nothing more than some separate, sinister entity that's at the root of all our problems. They'll warn that tyranny is always lurking just around the corner. You should reject these voices.
I think if you're one of these Tea Party groups that spent, in some cases, 2 years under an IRS inquisition, you might start to think that these voices are onto something.
President Crow and the Board of Regents will soon learn about being audited by the IRS.